Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here today. Great to see some familiar faces in the audience. As Brian said, my name is RYLAN, CEO and co-founder of SpacesShared. We're an intergenerational home sharing platform that works with post-secondary institutions across Canada to access the millions of empty bedrooms that exist to provide safe and affordable housing for students. Heard some criticism of the government in the conversation this morning, and I take a little bit of umbrage with it as the former manager of capital funding and programs of the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities. We tried to do some cool, innovative things there. I know the unit continues to do it. So if you're operating in Ontario, I encourage you to talk to some of those public servants, share some of the great ideas that have come up this morning. I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists, and then we are going to open it up for a fairly informal conversation. So first, GUELA SOLOW as the managing partner at PETROFF. She provides the firm with strategic agenda and guidance on professional, financial, legal, and administrative matters. And she's been responsible for many of the firm's new commissions in the P3 public-private partnerships sector. She's a graduate of the University of Toronto's Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design in 1985, another U of T grad. Thank you, GUELA, for joining this morning. To GUELA's right is Valerie Bruce, current Director of Student Housing and Strategic Partnerships at TMU. Over her 14-year career at TMU, she has advanced housing operations and administration through a variety of initiatives and protocols. She's very involved with the great student housing community, including holding the previous role of president of OACUHO and avid involvement with ACUHO, both housing organizations. She holds an MBA with a focus in organizational change management and public-private partnerships in student housing within Canada. Thank you for joining, Valerie. AMAL AWINI is Director of Housing and Conference Services at York University. Experienced, results-oriented, and strategic professional with over 20 years of experience in leading and building housing and conference operations in various institutions and provinces. A successful leader of diverse and achieved teams and an effective driver of institutional change initiatives that enhance the student experience and support the university's academic mission. Thanks, Amal, for joining. Finally, we have EMMANUEL ADEGBOYEGA, President, Executive Board, Residence Hall Association, Simon Fraser University Residences. He's a political science major, fantastic, so am I, with an international studies and criminology minor. He's the current Residence Hall Association President at SFU and a counselor on the Simon Fraser University Student Society. His passion is to advocate for students and to be a voice for the voiceless. He's currently in the third year of his degree and aspires to go to law school after his undergrad studies. So we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to ask the panel to start by answering the simple question: what one thing would you say has changed most in your role as a result of COVID? GUELA, do you want to take the first shot at this?
Hi, good morning, everyone. A lot has changed, obviously, since COVID, and we have an extremely short window of time to talk today. So I'm going to focus on one thing, which is alienation. Obviously, people were very isolated during COVID. If you think you're 20 years old, the 2 years of COVID is like 10% of your life, and almost all of your adult life was in isolation. So the transition to living in a residence is a big transition. And alienation, the alienation that people experienced during COVID is carried on strongly into the student environment. And as architects, we see ourselves as creating a framework for the real work that the people in student services do to combat that alienation, and the operators of student residences that we design, which is forum and campus suites that really run the buildings and really create the programs that so bring students together. So as architecture is a frame, there's a couple of things we do, and the first thing has to do with planning. So I'm going to talk about three things. So the first thing is the plan. In the floor plan, we do a range of communal spaces that try to create scales of community. So within the student residence, there are scales of rooms where a couple of people can gather, where maybe 5 or 6 people can gather, where the whole floor can gather, and the whole residence can gather, which is maybe up to 500 students in a courtyard. And those rooms are programmed with activities that bring students together, and they're knitted into everyday life. They're not a destination. And that's a really huge thing. It's not like you're working in your little studio or you're working in your room and you're going to go socialize. We knit those programmatic community rooms of all scales throughout the journey and the choreography of the building. So in the plan, that's sort of one thing to take away to combat alienation through design and architecture. The second thing is materiality, it's transparency, to create transparencies into those communal spaces. So as you're running to class, as you're running to take your garbage down to the garbage area, as you're going to do your laundry, you see into rooms and you see students and friends gathering of different scales, and you feel hopefully encouraged to join them, say hello, know that you could pop in and be part of that world. The third thing is transparency to the outside world. So lots of strategically placed glazing, which brings in views of the outside. This is Canada. The seasonal drama is spectacular. Bring that into the facility so students feel invigorated by the passing of seasons, and their diurnal cycles are gauged by sun, morning and evening. It's healthier for them, and they feel connected to the larger university campus by seeing outside of their room or outside of their kitchen into the larger campus to see what's happening, both with the weather, with the seasons, and with campus life. And the last thing is kind of an engineering thing, which is just light. Light is great for health and mental wellness. So bringing light into the facility through great lighting, but also through natural daylight is hugely important, as is fresh air. So all those things that bring, improve their mental health and wellness. So those are some of the things we're doing to combat alienation, and it has changed dramatically since COVID.
Fantastic. Valerie, do you want to comment on the number one thing that's changed since COVID for you?
Yeah, so hello everybody. I think the experience, I'll name it TMU. We primarily host incoming first year students, so we're looking at 17 to 18-year-olds. And I think the thing that many of us have chatted about often is the assumptions of what a 17 or 18-year-old can do, independent living, their assumptions, and then kick that back 3-4 years. So I often say some of our students are at really the development stage of a 15 or 16-year-old. So your assumptions in your operation or in our operation of what they come in knowing has changed, and our support and our ways of encouraging them, partly about getting involved in the community, has really had to shift and change. We have to be much more hands-on than I think we were a couple of years ago, and really finding ways to ensure students are clear on as simple things as how to use an HVAC unit, or what to do, like locking your door at night, all the way to obviously the variety of services that an institution offers when they're having issues, whether academically or personally. But that assumption of their maturity or their development, they lost those years, right? And so some of their experiences, the biggest one I'll explain is alcohol use, right? Many of our students did not experience alcohol use in high school where they may have 5-10 years ago. And so they're really experiencing some of those things for the first time. So we see more needs for intervention and support in terms of safe consumption and things like that in a way that I don't think we saw 5 years ago.
That's really interesting and speaks to obviously conversations around design and infrastructure, but it's just as important to talk about programming and supports and transitions. Amal, can you speak to what's changed most for you?
We've noticed quite a bit of change in terms of the need for housing. So there are some students that didn't particularly live on campus previously. After COVID, we've noticed that they are actually wanting that social interaction and wanted to be integrated more in the university settings and environment. So even with students that, some of the students that started during COVID and did not experience that, they were lacking that experience and wanted to experience it even later on. So initially we would have more first year students, but we've seen an increase in number of upper year students because they lack that experience. So they want to experience it and they want to have that integration connection. And this is not just with the domestic students. We've noticed also that increase in the international population as well. A lot wanted to travel more, wanted to be on site, wanted to live on campus and have that experience.
Fantastic. Emmanuel, great to hear the student perspective on this.
Yeah, I'll just pick up back off of what she said, because I think the greatest thing that has changed is student engagement. We notice students not as engaged as pre-COVID. So I guess a way that students have been trying to mitigate that is to be around students. So we see students that wouldn't previously live on residence begin to want to live on residence in order to just be in an environment that's filled with students. So another issue that's come because of that is now extended wait lists for students to get into housing because post-COVID, the types of engagement that we usually would get from students has decreased. So students, I guess, in their best ways to try to be engaged, to be around other fellow students. So we've also experienced an increase in amount of students wanting to live on residence.
Fantastic. Well, all of the panelists have foreshadowed the next question, which is around building community on campus, particularly in a post-COVID context. And I'll open it up to whoever wants to answer this first, but what are some specific initiatives or actions that you've taken to try to rebuild community and student housing in a post-pandemic context? Emmanuel, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, so I think in my interesting position, we work as an independent student organization, of course, in collaboration with the Residence Life team at SFU. So it gives us a unique way to try to bring about student engagement in a way that's student-led, as opposed to just staff that are disengaged from the students they're serving. So board is made up of students, and it's students creating possibilities for other students. So we collaborate, of course, with the Residence Life team to put together events that students would want to see. We noticed that the ways of engagement that in the past that students would want to be engaged has changed. So Residence Life, for example, might put together an event and get maybe 5% of students show up. But then when you have students organizing events for students, you see a much more increase because students know what students want to see. So a way that we've been trying to do that is actually interacting with students and getting direct feedback from students and working with students to put together events that they would want to see. So that's one way that we're trying to sort of rebuild or reorganize student engagement, is to get input from students directly and formulate programs around that.
The survey.
Yes. Yeah, so as you could see up there, we did put together a survey earlier this year, where we were able to get together some, I guess, direct student input. And as you could see on the survey speaks to many things. It speaks to the current living situation, and this was, I guess, a little bit post-COVID. We could see that I would say most students are within the range of at least very experiencing the Residence Life experience is between the ranges of very good to somewhat acceptable. So I think to answer your question is that we're working with students directly to get their input on how exactly they want to be engaged on residence.
Fantastic. Valerie or Amal, do you want to speak to this question of building community and maybe perhaps in the context of Emmanuel's feedback, like how are students engaged in that planning process?
Yeah, for sure. We've seen a huge increase in demand for different activities and different opportunities to get involved. That's across the board, as Amal mentioned. Obviously, there's a higher interest in living in residence, but not only that, then what kind of events and opportunities. And we got recent feedback that actually said our students are looking for more opportunities to connect identity group. And that may mean international students connecting with international students. That may mean equity deserving students connecting with equity deserving students, and so on and so on. And then finding ways to build community. I think when we think about, again, the experience over the last couple of years, a lot of that was digital. They don't know how to talk to each other. They don't know how to say hi, how are you? if you attended post-secondary and had an orientation week, the experience that you had at your time and then the experience, we're trying to create something similar, but students don't know how to interact with each other. And so really finding ways that we can provide opportunity for them to build those relationships and connections. The feedback has been more, give us as many opportunities as possible. And that's a range, right? Certainly to Emmanuel's point, the programming that our professional staff do is really related to what do we think you need to learn and how to develop in your career as in our case, an incoming first year student. And then we partner with our students to really look at what are some of the other social and other opportunities that students want to engage. The often joke on many campuses is they'll like bring pizza or bring food and students will come. That's changed. Students don't really care about food anymore. They really are looking for a bit more than that, a bit more of like, what is this actually going to get me, whether it's supporting my academic or my social initiatives. And so we really have to think hard about how to not only sell it to them, but make sure it's something that's actually worthwhile beyond just like a couple free pieces of pizza.
Amal is nodding vigorously, so you clearly agree with Valerie's feedback. Just given who's in the room, maybe I'll come back to that question, say any advice for folks that are in the process of designing facilities, that are looking at PPPs, like what do you think is the most critical thing that anyone who's designing, building, operating student housing should be thinking about? Amal?
So definitely something that's conducive for that environment. I don't think the concept that we're coming out of COVID, that the students are looking for more of a social interactions is gonna go away in time. I think if anything, there is more an increased number of students that are actually looking into that, and that will likely stay. So when building, keep that in mind, that they don't want to be in an apartment by themselves, isolated. They want to have interaction. They still want to have their own space, so they ideally prefer to be in a room by themselves with their washroom, but then they still have a lot of ability to interact with other students, whether that's through gym, common areas, any other means for them to be able to gather over meals, over study rooms, any ways to be able to interact more and more with their peers.
Fantastic. GUELA.
So just building on that, the kind of tricky part, or the part that I think requires a lot of thought on the part of planners, is what kinds of social spaces really resonate with the diverse student community that we have these days, especially with international students. And that palette of community uses is something that needs to be considered carefully. I would respectfully disagree with Mike on the washroom story. You know, unless the shared washrooms are really carefully designed, I think given the different kind of identity groups that exist in the student population today, that can be really tricky to manage. And you know, is something like a swimming pool really like social engagement? So I think like those are examples of community areas that may or may not be successful in actually building community. And what I spoke about earlier, which is creating this like natural inclination to gather spontaneously, bumping into somebody, you know, doing a study room together that is not programmed from the top down, but it's more grassroots. I think design can really contribute to that through knitting those programmatic spaces into the routine or path of student life. And when we look back at like, there's stable rental communities in North American and European cities like for decades, like people that have spent generations in a rental housing environment. My family for sure, when they came to North America, they've lived in the same apartment in New York for 80 years. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from building stable communities, stable rental communities. And our client at Campus Suites, Henry Morton, always says when you build community, you build retention, which means people want to stay there for perhaps their whole university experience. And I think that really, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from stable rental communities and how we can build them so the community is over generations.
Perfect. Emmanuel, love to hear what the key thing is from a student's perspective.
Yeah, I think there are. Okay, I think there are many things that I think should probably be taken into consideration. Brian, are we able to pull up the slides again? If you could go to the fourth question. But I have an interesting opportunity of working with students, I think, that make up probably the population of most universities, which is a demographic of students from all across the world. At SFU, we have students, we have international students, domestic students, and I think this could be something that's also helpful to take into consideration is at least the number one thing that student ranked as probably important to them when picking where to live and things like that is proximity to amenities. So that could mean whether to their classes, whether to athletic facilities, the essential needs of students. That was the number one thing that they ranked as important to them when choosing where to live or in places that buildings are decided to be built on. The next thing that probably you could see is on-campus dining. So that could be from direct dining services produced by the residents, or it could just be proximity to places of food and things like that. Something else that's also high on the rating would be collaboration. So that's collaboration between building facilities and having proximity to other things that they need to themselves. Something else is also being close to retail and grocery stores. And if you could go to the seventh question. This is also another thing that you could also take into consideration that students want to see in buildings and infrastructures and things like that is Wi-Fi, internet, of course, clean spaces. Security also ranks as one of the high things. Eating and cooling systems, food services, parking, and you could see that those are some of the top things that students want to see developers and buildings have or been taken into account.
Fantastic.
One group that I also want to add that's often overlooked is students with families or mature students. Often when we look into building, we focus on the dorm or apartments, small apartments with shared, but there's this group that their needs are different. And we don't consider them as much, but this is a very important group, especially because a lot of our graduate students are international students that actually come with the need for housing. A lot of them come with families. So although they may need the apartment style because they're coming with family, it's imperative to have common spaces for them where the kids can play, where the partners can be engaged in other community activities and whatnot. So this is one area that I think we often don't focus on it when we think about student housing as much.
Well, thanks for that, Amal. I actually lived in student family housing at U of T for 2 years. And the combined services, the proximity to campus, the childcare facilities, it was really critical to acknowledge, obviously, the needs of diverse students. We're standing between you and lunch. I'm going to ask one more question to the panel and ask them to answer it fairly quickly, and then I'll open it up to questions. The question is, as I've heard the conversation today, and as we thought about building spaces shared, affordability is a really key consideration. We've heard a little bit about it today. And maybe what I'll ask is, particularly in the Toronto context, well known as the most expensive or second most expensive real estate market in Canada, what does affordability look like for a York student or a TMU student?
This is a very tricky question, because if you ask one student what is affordable housing to you, it could be completely different of another student. You have students that's, international students that's coming from Japan with specific expectations and specific budget. It's different than a student that's coming from a different part of the world that can't necessarily afford the same thing. For them, is they're coming on a very limited budget, and they would rather settle for something that's not as big or whatnot, that doesn't offer as much services, but they still want to have affordable housing. Especially, for me, being in Toronto, GTA market, affordability can be really very tricky. But if there's one thing that we hear for most students, you kind of have the mix of those students that want the very nice facilities with the bells and whistles and everything and can afford the higher rate. But you also have the other group that wanted to maintain a low cost, and you don't want to risk of having them going across the street where they can live in, you know, in somebody's basement or with another 6-7 people. So I guess you have to always be below the market price. You can't be the same sector as, you know, the private area. We do have other services, and our focus is not just the money, but our services go beyond that. But nonetheless, you can't be higher than the private market, or even in comparison, you have to be always slightly below that.
Thanks, Amal. Valerie and then GUELA.
Yeah, I would say similar. We did a study with Scion last year. And what was interesting feedback we got for TMU students specifically is they would be much more willing to travel upwards of 2 hours. And this incentive to live and rent downtown would have to drop. I think it was at least $500 for them to weigh those out and be like, yeah, it's worth paying the $500 more than me commuting 2+ hours twice. So that's one way. And that was quite surprising for Mike, and not as surprising for me in terms of working at TMU for a long time and the culture around commuting. Obviously, I think a lot of folks, when they think about TMU, assume it's a lot of commuting students. That's changing. We've always had demand. We've seen a huge demand increase in the last couple of years, certainly connected to what Amal was mentioning, of more students wanting that in-campus experience and to really be integrated. But their sensitivity is there. I think certainly it's important to have a diverse options. There are students who have the means or have support to pay some of the higher options, and then you have students who, you know, are really challenged. I often talk a lot about parents who is their second child coming to TMU, because they might have had a student who went to a KW school or a London school and has an idea of what rent is, and then comes to the city of Toronto and is like, but how much is it really going to be? At the Ontario University Fair, I had a dad that was like, but is it really like $4,000 a month? And I was like, well, it depends on what you want, right? Maybe, but you have to make those decisions. And so we try to do a lot of education, but I think it is sensitivity, but it's providing opportunity, right? So you have a plethora of options for students who need those different areas, and certainly looking at affordability as an option around space to make those costs lower on the development end and the construction end to meet obviously the finances required.
I think it's really important that through design, we can address this question of affordability and make sure that we're not isolating students that can afford the higher rents from those that can't. So creating a range and typology of different housing options within one building and one residence is really important. I mean, students are being educated about all kinds of things, and living with people from different socioeconomic brackets than yourself or your family is critical to a university experience. And so having, you know, the single room with the bathroom that is private and shower that's private is great to have in a building, along with shared facilities, shared bedrooms, shared washrooms. And so having that range of typologies within one residence really addresses affordability through design.
Great, and I want to make sure the student voice is the last voice heard on the question of affordability.
I think when it comes to student housing, there will always be that relationship between, I think it's been probably mentioned throughout the conference, is the situation of residents department not directly getting funding from the university. I know in BC, I think it was also mentioned, we do work with the provincial government, and I think earlier this year, had a great opportunity to open up a new facility and new residence with the provincial government up at SFU. But I think when it comes to student housing, there'll always be that interesting play on affordability, because of course the residents and housing team also depend on student fees in order to meet operational costs and things like that. So I think the discourse about affordability and making things more affordable for students, I think the structure on how student housing is being ran also need to be considered, because if direct funding is being relied on students in order to keep things running, then we could always expect affordability to be an interesting line, and increases will always come as a result of that, because there's a direct correlation between those three things, between those two things. And I say for at least for student housing that it's built on three pillars, at least three essential pillars. One of them is affordability. The second one is accessibility. And then the third one is proximity. I think I already spoke on the proximity element is students appreciate when services are close to what they need to access as students. And then of course, accessibility is ensuring that everyone is able to access student housing. And I think was also mentioned is the dining commons and dining services that most times comes as part of student housing is this requirement to also be in the meal plan. And when we speak of affordability, when we see that the meal plans are costing about $4,000 per semester, then you see how that could be an affordability crisis for students when not only can they not afford to pay for just housing, but they also have to pay for a meal plan to go together with that. So in a semester, a student is spending between $6,000 to $8,000 alone in order to just access student housing. So affordability also ties to its ability to be accessible to students. And I think to make things more accessible for students, the structure on how student housing is ran alone will need to be considered. And of course, the requirement or the clause that we tie the financial clause that comes with students choosing to live on student housing will also need to be considered.
Fantastic. I don't know if anyone else was hearing that soft jazz playing for a little while there. I thought maybe that was a way of telling us to get off the stage so folks could eat lunch. It's not playing anymore, so maybe we have some more time. But I'll open it up to just a couple of questions from the audience, and then we will get out of the way of your lunch. Any questions for the panelists? Yes. Sure. So it's a great question. Just to repeat for the room and the panel, if anyone didn't hear it, the question is there's a rise in different gender identities and expressions. How do you balance that against other expectations and beliefs within a student housing context?
I think most of the spaces right now, most of the rooms are inclusive of all genders, so they're not specified for one gender or another. Now, you're always faced with the to your point that there is a balance there, that you have some people, some international students that one single gender because of religious beliefs or whatnot. So you have to have the mix of both, although the predominantly most residents are all inclusive. So it is that you give people the option of, if this is an important thing for you and to be in a single gender, then you are in it. But if not, it's the common thing, it's all inclusive. Also education. A lot of the students don't particularly understand. I mean, when you're speaking to, whether that's through your Don's RAs or you're even talking to some students, some of them don't particularly understand that concept in the beginning, and they're more receptive to it than you think, just because they didn't know. So information, when whether that's through the website, whether that's communication directly with the student, explain what that is, basically what that means, and that would be very helpful. But definitely you have to have the balance between the two and making sure that everybody feels safe, because that's one of the key things about being residents.
Emmanuel, go ahead.
I think at SFU we've been able to address that effectively. Of course, as you mentioned, all residences are open to all, it's gender inclusive. But I think something we've also added to our plate is that within each building or each infrastructure, there are floors that are dedicated to specific genders. So those floors, whether it's an all-female floor, an all-male floor, those are also a possibility that student could take advantage of if they wanted to as well. So I think in addition to the ability that all residents and all rooms are gender inclusive, we've also gone further to take a better position of creating floors within each building that allows for students to even be more specific in their accommodational needs.
I'm going to ask GUELA to comment on this, but just looking out into the room, any other questions from the panel? Okay, then GUELA, you're the last thing before lunch.
Just to state the obvious, we're headed towards a world where gender is not a binary topic anymore. So to say that we have single sex, single gender floors has been a pretty good solution up until now, but I just leave everybody with the question of where we're headed with that if in a world where it's not binary.
Well, big